There's a big difference between a UN peacekeeping force and a NATO one. The new Gaza force must preserve this fragile peace. Here's how it should be set up. There's a big difference between a UN peacekeeping force and a NATO one. At last, a peace of sorts eventually seems to have come to Gaza and Israel, but maintaining it may be as hard as getting here in the first place. Once the dust hopefully settles in Gaza and a huge sigh of relief resonates around the globe, the even more daunting challenge begins. Both the UN and the Trump 20-point plan suggest that an International Stabilisation Force, ISF, is required to maintain the ceasefire and begin the daunting and complex humanitarian operation to feed the starving, turn the power and water back on, start the clear-up, rebuild, and in time establish a local Palestinian police force. To begin with, a small contingent from U.S. Central Command is setting up a civil Military Co-ordination Centre to get things moving. Some are suggesting, among them me, that the stabilization force should replicate the structures and methods of KFOR, the Kosovo force, set up around 25 years ago to keep the peace in the province of Kosovo. I was involved with KFOR as a youngish army officer for several years. We were focused on building a secure environment and guaranteeing the freedom of movement through all Kosovo territory for all citizens, irrespective of their ethnic origins. KFOR operated under a UN resolution, but it was a NATO force, not a UN one. This is a very important difference. Secondly, KFOR focused on enabling humanitarian aid and getting the local infrastructure up and running again. As in Gaza, there were major ethnic and religious issues. KFOR is in fact still in place, though it is much smaller these days and being slowly wound down. Israel and Hamas agree to pause in fighting in Gaza. The first challenge for the Gaza ISF is its makeup and force structure. Most likely, the force will predominantly be made up of soldiers from Middle Eastern countries who are acceptable to Israel as well as the Palestinians. The Qataris have been key players in negotiations thus far, and the Hamas leadership has often been resident in Doha, so they are likely contributors. However, the small Gulf state does not have the troop numbers to go it alone. Around 60,000 soldiers will be needed, as with the original KFOR, to provide an effective stabilization force. First and closest to the challenge is Egypt, who are already putting troops forward with Qatar. To begin with, by providing security troops to the U.S. initial mission. It is also likely that the Saudis, who are the closest to the Israelis, would provide some of the force, along with other Gulf states like UAE and Oman. These nations can do much of the heavy lifting when it comes to the enablers, such as C-17 heavy transport aircraft and heavy-lift helicopters. Turkey has also expressed a keen interest in getting involved, which would seem sensible as it sits betwixt the West and the Middle East in many helpful ways: cultural, ethnic, and religious. As with KFOR, the rules of engagement, ROE, for the force will be most important. This is a monumental challenge. The ROE must be robust enough that any attempt by Hamas or other groups to reignite conflict can be put down, but sensitive enough that small indiscretions by a poor and starving population are not punished overly harshly. It is vital that the ISF is effective in making sure it is the only significant armed group in Gaza, so that the Israelis do not perceive threats or suffer attacks and feel tempted to act themselves. The ISF must also avoid antagonizing the people and becoming engaged in a war of occupation against them. Once lines are drawn, perhaps with 4 or 5 international brigades in place across Gaza, as there were in Kosovo, the humanitarian and reconstruction task can begin in earnest. Whether this operation is based out of Egypt or Israel doesn't really matter, but